So welcome back. This is Night Flight, and Troy McLachlan is back, and we are going to continue our conversation about the Saturn Death Cult. We have done a couple of interviews right now, and I think this is the fourth that we are doing. So I'm very happy to have Troy back, and yeah, Troy, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on your show. Great to be back.
Yeah. So, Troy, for those listeners who haven't seen the three other ones, just briefly try to explain what this Saturn Death Cult is. If I remember correctly, it's, for instance, it is not a secret society.
No, it's not a secret society. And the I argue that the Saturn Death Cult is a cultural phenomenon that exists worldwide, various cultures. And it's identifiable by its symbols, by its use of symbols, and by the kinds of institutions it creates to facilitate a small elite that have a very distorted understanding of what in mythology would be called, or in Jungian terms be called, the Saturn creator God archetype. They have a very distorted idea of that. My book, Saturn Death Cult, argues that most of these symbols are associated with occult thinking, with secret societies, with the kind of cultural phenomena that we're talking about. This all has its origins in a series of planetary catastrophes, where a new cosmology is proffered for people to consider as an alternative history for how our solar system was formed, which of course is probably one of the most radical elements of the book. I think there are plenty of books out there that catalog what I call the Saturn Death Cult and various, other sort of guises, whether they talk about Illuminati or international banking, that kind of stuff. Plenty of books on that. But my book proffers the idea that our solar system's history is very, very different to the one we're taught today, that in fact, the skies of the ancients was radically different to the one that we see today, and that within the time span of human existence on the planet, we went from being a satellite of a brown dwarf star that was captured by the sun in a absolutely cataclysmic series of encounters, and that planetary system was ripped up by the sun, and over a period of time witnessed by humans, the planets rearranged themselves into the current configuration. But I would argue the current configuration that we see in the heavens today has really only settled down since as recently as 600 to 500 BC, or before current era, some people would say. So within human remembrance, and even within human historical times, the skies were incredibly different. And as a result of that, there were a series of symbols derived from the events that took place, from the cosmic bodies that were witnessed in the sky. And these were associated with these cataclysms, these doomsdays that took place where the Saturnian system with Earth, Mars, and Venus broke up to be rearranged by the sun. And as a result of that rearrangement, great catastrophe hit the Earth. The Earth changed fundamentally, and as a result of that, these archetypes of doomsday, a Saturn creator god, based on the planet Saturn and its activity and so on, became absolutely indelibly, almost ingrained into the vast human corporate psyche. And the result is that since those times, we have had malicious groups who have sought to exploit, for their own benefit, the greater population through the use of symbols in triggering archetypes and so on that come from that time. And they've done so as a way of ensuring that they basically live a lifestyle which is akin to the first great golden age, which is discussed in the book, and their desire to create a new human-made golden age at a future time. So the book is really about these two golden ages, one that was lost through planetary catastrophes, interplanetary catastrophes, and a new golden age that is sought by elite occult groups who have utilized symbolism and archetypes derived from ancient times in order to facilitate their desire to, well, to put it bluntly, to rule the world in the way that they see fit.
Okay, when you say a human-made now golden age, then I take it that that is different from the natural cycle.
Yeah, it's the idea that those who worship the distorted version of Saturn, the non-distorted version of the Saturn creator god, is a god of justice who gives you weights and measures that can be relied upon to give justice for everybody on equal terms, and so on. The distorted version of Saturn worship is a worship that is involved around positioning yourself to have influence with the Saturn creator god, and the result of that kind of thinking is that people seek to have influence in society and with the god rather than justice as a governing principle of how we, relate to each other, how we interact with each other. And so institutions have developed around this idea that it is more important to have social standing, social influence, than it is to deliver equal justice, throughout the population. And their idea of a new golden age is that they have inherited Saturn's role, or the Saturn creator god's role, of determining that which is right and that which is wrong. They have become the self-appointed heirs to Saturn in deciding what is right and what is wrong, and they do so through a process of influence amongst themselves in their worship of Saturn. And even for those who are not even worshippers of a god, it's the worship of the human being as the final arbitrator of what is right and wrong. And that human being will obviously be the most elite, the person who has the most status, the most power, really. So developing power is the means by which they justify their role as arbitrators of what is right and wrong, how we govern ourselves, how our laws are made, what laws are right, what are not, and why, because of this influential thing, we have increasingly started to exist in the world. It's not even just a two-tier system, it's a multi-tier system of justice that for the same crime committed, people on the lower rungs get judged differently to people up in the higher echelons. And that is something that has been developed down through the ages. And in my opinion, it exists because of the single greatest tool ever devised for the control of other human beings, which is the debt-based slavery financial system, which is now the international central banking model. So, when people talk about, Saturn Death Cult, naturally it conjures up that it's an evil thing. And I would say that anybody who seeks to control other human beings has an agenda, has an inherent evilness to it. But when you look at even our criminal activities on this planet, on the planet as it is at the moment, it's blindingly obvious that whether it's arms trafficking, illegal drug trafficking, international sex trafficking, sex slavery, that kind of stuff, we are constantly told that these things are multi-billion, if not trillion-dollar industries. Now, you don't run an industry like that with suitcases of cash. You have to have a banking institution to do it. So when people realize that the very people that we sit down at our TVs and listen to, and they're going to tell us how the economy is going to go, who's going to get what benefit in terms of budgeting, all this sort of stuff, how the money is going to be done. These are actually exactly the same people who have created an institution that facilitates arms trafficking, illegal drug trafficking, and international sex slavery trafficking, and any other criminal activity that requires more than just cash, to be used. That's the, at the end of the day, I would say, if you're going to be looking for the Saturn Death Cult culture in its essence, look to the people who control those institutions, that central banking, international finance system, because everything that is evil in our world, that is carried out by these organized crimes, by, we're talking about extreme political groups, anything that along those lines, whether it's Joseph Stalin or, Lenin or Adolf Hitler or Mao Zedong, they all required money to get where they were and do the crimes that they committed. And the international banking system sits there in the background and nobody looks at them. Every now and then people get an inkling, but they don't understand the power these people hold. They could shut down these criminal organizations, these extreme political organizations very, very quickly, but they do not, because it facilitates a cultural trend that I'm talking about, where our society becomes more and more degraded. We become more and more attuned to, I've got to become more influential to be able to succeed. And if I get into trouble with the law, I want to be influential. So institutions like Masonry, chivalric orders, royalty, aristocracy, and so on, they're all governed around this idea of having influence, as opposed to being a impartial dispenser of justice. They might cloak themselves originally, but now, I think in our day and age now, Judith, there's absolutely no, they don't even hide it anymore. It's about getting rich. It's get rich or die trying,
Yeah, exactly. And I find it is getting very, very obvious, especially right now, this prescribed reality that we have to adhere to. And there's only one narrative, and only we tell you the truth, and do not listen to anybody else. And now we even have a truth ministry in the United States.
Couldn't be more obvious. Yeah.
That, and there you would say that is a classic Saturn Death Cult behavior.
Yes, it's the, you've got to have the influence that's most important. For instance, in social media, they even talk about influencers. It starts, I think, in Western society, when you had, I can talk sort of in English culture or British culture, and in the 1920s, 1930s, a boy growing up, I can't speak for girls, but I can speak for, what the lads sort of tended to look to. Their heroes were people like T. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. They would look towards people, great authors, that sort of stuff. By the time you get to the 70s, it's effete pop groups and bands, and a lot of these bands are using very much the symbolism I discuss in the book to promote a lot of what they're doing. And you see that cultural shift to the modern age of the social influencer. Bands became more important by the 1970s onwards, or really since the Beatles. It became more important to know what they thought, all right, than what your neighbor thought, than what your local council thought or something. And this was promoted to such a degree that the cult of celebrity, in terms of Hollywood, was financed to this level. Again, Hollywood would not exist without the international banking system. All right. you've got to have that banking system in place in order for these industries to work. But you've got to have a banking system that can control the population in terms of its own status, its debt status. You know, something that you can put entire nations into debt so that they owe and feel they owe, and thereby can be controlled by the issuance of that money as a debt. And, you know, and basically their culture starts to run on that system. I've always described it, Judith, as a system that always guarantees that somebody loses at the end of every year. All right. At the beginning, it's only a small bunch of people that lose, and who cares about them? Maybe they were just slack people, laggards and all that. My argument is it doesn't matter if there's no slack people or laggards or lumpen proletariat, whatever your terminology is for people that you don't feel sorry for when they sort of lose. If they don't even exist, someone is still going to lose in a debt-based system, and that grows bigger and larger and larger. And after about 40 years, it starts to teeter. By 70 years and by 80 years, it usually implodes. We are now effectively into 120 years in the current system, which some people date from the 1970s with America going off the gold standard and the international reserve currency being the American dollar. But really, the founding of the American Federal Reserve, I think, is your date from there. And they have learned in their system, wonderful as control that it is, it does collapse and it under its own weight after a certain period of time, usually between 70 and 80 years, at the most 100, 120, it's really pushing it. And when it collapses, their objective is to be in control of that collapse so that they can then reinstitute the system that collapsed, a new version of it, as a solution for the collapse. And this ties back into the whole idea of an elite that wants a new golden age. They believe a golden age is a symmetry. The old ancient golden age collapsed in a doomsday event. The new golden age will be brought about by a global doomsday event, but this will be man-made. It won't be cosmic in nature. And so in my book, I point out that really what they're looking for is a population reduction down to a good 500 million if they can do so, a banking system and credit system that has total control over your ability to function within society. We've had that kind of control really, really since the founding of the Bank of England, which was the granddaddy and still is the granddaddy of all the central banks. You know, whoever is in control of the Bank of England really controls a whole lot. The Federal Reserve is just a branch of the Bank of England. The Bank of England and what they call the City of London, which is a separate entity to England, Great Britain. The City of London is like the Vatican. It's like Washington, D.C. They're entities that exist outside of the law of the countries that host them. They have their own sort of boundaries and legal system and so on like that. And there you will find the mechanisms in place for the whole control system of, to use a biblical term, you will not be able to buy or sell lest you have the mark of the beast, so to speak. Okay. And to me, that mark of the beast has always been a debt-based financial system. In whatever form it comes, whether it's digital, whether it's cash money, whether it's contractual or whatever, their whole objective is to make sure that you can do nothing lest you have their system of being able to operate, which is the money system that they have. And so they propose a new system brought about by a global cataclysm, man-made cataclysm. I think we're seeing what they tried to implement today, whether it's what's going on with the pharmaceutical companies, their input through disease and what's the term? Not famine, because that's what they're starting up now with the derived destruction of the supply chains and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Pestilence. So war, pestilence, famine, and and ultimately death. The four horsemen of the apocalypse, as people like to call it. As far as that goes, they've attempted this, and I think they would have had their way had there not been certain things done in the world that have completely thrown the equation, out of kilter. That's why I'm optimistic. But had they had their way, it would have been a pretty dreadful world to be living through today if it had gone according to how they wanted.
And what event was that, in your opinion, that prevented the full implementation?
Some would say it was the election of Trump and such. I think the Brexit sort of situation was a shot across the bows, but the election of Trump should really be seen as the thwarting of Hillary Clinton in terms of that. Whoever it was that they did and so on. Hillary Clinton's job was to get America into a war. There was absolutely no doubt that had a war taken place, they could literally suspend the United States Constitution and implement rule by decree because of war. That's what governments do. They love war. It gives them such incredible powers. The United Kingdom has never relinquished the powers it gave its government gave itself in the First World War and the Second World War. They're still in play. If the government believes a certain thing about me, I'm living here in Britain, I can disappear, I believe, 90 days into jail and then ongoing for another 230 days when nobody has to be notified that they have me in control. Now, ostensibly, that was to, catch spies during the wars, things like that. But they still have it today. They use the IRA threat in the 70s and the 80s to expand that, further. But they have those kinds of powers here. And they never relinquish that. And the United States, the people, the globalists, and that is a hallmark, is somebody a globalist in terms of their, identity of beliefs, that they believe the entire planet should go in one direction as decided by themselves, by those people, ministry, truth, all that sort of stuff. But these globalists had a major problem in the sense that the United States had that Second Amendment right, which was the ability to arm themselves. Your country went through a trauma with the Nazis. A lot of people don't realize that the first law that Adolf Hitler instituted on becoming chancellor, only on 33% of the vote, and he was given chancellor, but he immediately started confiscating weapons and controlling private gun ownership. Britain did the same thing pretty well much after the English Civil War, and so on like that. So wherever you get tyrants, they don't like a population that can fight back. And the United States is unique in the world in that sense, that it, for anybody who wants to try and control the United States, you've got to deal with X amount of millions of guns in the hands of private people. And of course, a lot of people say, oh, this is terrible. They're murdering each other at unprecedented rates and things like that. But it's also this bulwark against a government that would want to murder you at unprecedented rates and so on like that. And that's why it was written that whatever the weaponry might be. And it was Hillary Clinton's job to nullify the aspect of the American Constitution. And the best way to do it was if a couple of cities get nuked either by whatever it was, North Korea. I think they would have fired a missile out, and whoever had the opportunity in America to have one of these missing cruise missile nukes that went missing during the Bush era and so on like that, a couple of cities gets nuked. When you're facing that kind of thing, you tend to buckle down and so on. Then you get hit by a pestilence, by a disease, by something, just like happened in the First World War playbook. And then comes the destruction of the population's immune system through lack of nutrition, and so on. And it would have been a home slam dunk. We would have all been sitting in our homes saying, "Save us, save us, save us! Anything, we'll do what just don't let my city get nuked. Just save us from the pestilence. Just do all this sort of stuff." They've been playing with this stuff for years. I believe serial killing was in America. The explosion of serial killing was all part of making the police state more palatable. It was the Phoenix program from Vietnam being brought back to America. It was great at making, people say, yeah, give the police more powers. We've got to deal with these kinds of people. So that's what I think the event was. Hillary Clinton didn't get in. She couldn't facilitate the changes in American government and thereby society that was needed to turn America from a constitutional republic into a socialist democracy.
But wouldn't you say that they are pretty much back on track? I get what you are saying, and I'm not doubting that. Let's say Trump would probably not have gone along with that. But in general, I don't see him as
being able to
really
rescue the
an
situation.
Alternative.
I really don't know. I'll tell you the biggest thing that I find most curious. I'm not claiming I know what is going on and so on, as far as it goes, but this whole Ukrainian, Putin versus Zelensky type sort of thing. I think Ukraine, if you wanted to see a model for the gangster Saturn Death Cult state, where everything is influence, everything is who who you can bribe, all this sort of stuff. All this money that they're pumping into Ukraine, I think, has nothing to do with buying them the latest, missiles or things like that. It's because Ukraine was very largely set up as a money laundering system for the entire, deep state. Again, what I would call the Saturn Death Cult culture in the socio-political, culture that we have in the West. I think it's absolutely diabolical, and I have no doubt that they were behind it. But these biological weapons labs, or just biological labs. All right. First, they didn't exist. Now they exist. They were never meant for weapons. There's a whole lot of them. Why does Ukraine have all these labs?
Did you see the Russians released new material about the?
I saw that only this morning. Didn't have time to read through it. Yeah.
They are naming the politicians and the companies that are having direct.
The Western politicians, yeah.
Yeah.
So I would say Hunter Biden's right up there.
They name all the American politicians.
Oh wow! And that was today or yesterday?
Yeah, I read it this morning.
Well, you see, that's I look at that and I just wonder that if Joe Biden was truly, running things in terms of what a president of the United States could do, I think he would have loved to have committed American soldiers to the front lines of Ukraine from day one. But something is stopping him from doing it. I'm not sure why. And, there's a lot of talk on the internet about, who's really in control in America, who's doing this, what is Putin's real objectivity? I mean, for me, Putin has been saying for decades now, and it's before he was even a politician and such like that, but the expansion of NATO to the Russian border could not be tolerated, let alone into a part that has been historically part of Russia, you know, for over 1,000 years.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of Ukraine sort of being that way, but it seems like he's gone in there and he's strategically cleaned up those places. In other words, all the places under Russian control just happen to be all the places where the labs are. That's what I understand. All right, as far as that goes. I think the Chinese are poised to do the same thing in Taiwan. Have you ever heard of a guy called Dave Emery, Judith?
Say that name again.
Dave Emery.
Dave Emery. Yes, I am familiar, but I do not get a face.
Okay, you probably won't. He's really a radio personality from, he started back in the 70s and the 80s. He's still going now. He just puts out his podcasts now and so on like that. But Dave Emery, who is of a very different political persuasion to me, to myself and so on, but I have the utmost respect for the work that he's done in terms of cataloging what he calls the underground Reich, or some people would refer to it as the Fourth Reich. Dave Emery has for decades been banging on that there is an international, what Joseph Farrell calls the international Nazi, and that that really the European Union and the way it was conceived and brought up, and it's crikey, talk about full of Saturn symbols and that lot. If you want to go looking for influences from mythology and such. But Dave Emery has basically said that when Germany lost the shooting war, it began the Nazi Party through the Bormann organization, International Bormann organization, began an international Reich that was established throughout Europe, still with the high echelon banking families of Germany and so on like that. But they went down to Argentina. They got established in South America. They were heavily involved with all the scientists, German scientists that were brought to America under paperclip and so on like that. And so, and there's even a case to be made that the Trump family is part of that clique, that Anglo-American clique that came out of the what Dave Emery calls the Fourth Reich. But Dave Emery has for years, the last 5, 6, maybe longer years, been calling the warning on what was happening in Ukraine in terms of neo-Nazi organizations. And what you're talking about the Azov Battalion, and I forget the name of the particular group that they have in Ukraine. But of course, a lot of people forget that many Ukrainians joined with Germany in the Second World War, kind of defected during the Second World War, and were, what would you say? They greeted the Germans initially as liberators from the hated Russians, so to speak. So there's always been that very strong element there. So the whole neo-Nazi thing, or international fascism, has shifted out of the German world and moved into the Ukrainian world, at least in the last 20 to 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. And that's where it is most strong. And the only other country in the world that is coming close to Ukraine in terms of a neo-fascist influence is Taiwan. And it would seem that the Chinese are basically just watching what's going on with Ukraine, with the Russians. And I think they're going to go into Taiwan. And I guarantee you're going to find biological labs in Taiwan, as far as that goes. So what is going on behind the scenes? I have no idea, but why does Ukraine have so many biological labs? A country where there was no oversight, you could buy and deal and do. In other words, the ultimate country where influence was the only factor. There's no justice to be had in the Ukraine. Yeah. And, so it remains to be seen if because Dave Emery, in following all the influence of international fascism, when it got centered in Spain after the war with the Franco kind of government, but you had even the Muslim Brotherhood are very closely linked into international fascism.
Oh, yeah.
And so, as far as the Grand Mufti and, of Jerusalem and so on, they're linked. Many former members of the SS went down into Egypt. It's one of those celebrated. Everybody talks about, Nazis running off to Argentina and so on like that. But many of them ended up in Egypt and Syria. These places had huge influence. So I think in many respects, while I say there's a case that Trump maybe came out of that side of things, I think he's largely broken from what you would call the international Nazi or the international fascist organization. And I think that war that's going on in Ukraine is the first part in a global war to eradicate international fascism and Nazism as a force behind the scenes.
You can't eradicate the ideology.
You can't eradicate the ideology, but you can eradicate the infrastructure of power. And again, it comes back to what is that infrastructure of power? Joseph Farrell, he made some startling points about when we had the 2008 financial crisis, 2007, 2008. He had calculated that there was a payment due in terms that when the Nazis, we'll say not the Nazis, when Martin Bormann created his organization in the last couple of years of the war to basically, divide the wealth, get it out there, but keep the Nazi party as an entity going in terms of its ideology, but have the financial clout for it. That one of the places that they dumped a lot of their stolen cash was in the Anglo-American banking system, because the Bushes and all these sorts of families and so on like that, they were never really truly anti-Nazi and such. As far as that goes, we know that the Bush family in particular, who represented banking interests during the 1930s and so on, were heavily involved in financing Adolf Hitler through various channels and such.
Preston Bush, the granddad.
Yeah, Prescott Bush. Yeah. Bush family and so on. I mean, he basically got run out of town. And they went into oil, but they were a banking family prior to that. And, they were bonesmen, they Skull and Bones, who also have a link to a German chapter. There's supposedly a second chapter of a German university chapter. I've never been able to quite establish which German chapter, but there's that German connection between the Skull and Bones and society in Germany of a similar nature. Again, all influence, all about peddling influence. But
Bush is also a German name.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
We write it a little bit differently with a C between the S and the H, but other than that, But you've also got to look at another lot there. A lot of people very, very conveniently forget, was the British royal family, who the Bushes are also involved in. They call themselves Windsor, but they're actually Saxe-Coburg. Yeah.
All right, they've got a bit of Scottish.
Have a German queen.
Yes, we and have had since we've had a German royal family since Victoria married, and she was Hanoverian, but Queen Victoria marrying Albert of Saxe-Coburg. Saxe-Coburg were considered the sort of stud stable of Europe. They farmed out their princes to various queens in waiting and so on like that. And then her marriage to Prince Philip, who died recently, which brought him into the Battenberg family, or Mountbatten, as it became known in English and so on. Huge German influence with a bit of Scottish influence from the Queen Mother and so on like that. You have that sort of element. But, so you've got those sort of German connections, even in the royal family, of the Bushes and so on like that. There's connections there. I look at some of the Bush family faces, and I can see, the House of Windsor, the royal family in Britain. I can see how they would be distant cousins at the very least, and such. That makes perfect sense. But getting back to what Farrell said, was that when all that money, ill-gotten money that that Martin Bormann had accrued as a slush fund for after the war, not to fight the war, and probably Hitler had no idea that Bormann was doing this to any great degree, but that money was dumped in the American Anglo banking establishment. And then the American Anglo banking establishment over the years hypothecated that the money and so on and such in ways that created the banking crisis of 2008. Now, when Hank Paulson went into Congress and said, I've written a page long of reasons why you now have to give us 750 billion, to save the banking system. If you don't, it collapses tomorrow, and so on. So do it now. And Joseph Farrell linked that to about the amount of money that was due to the Bormann organization in terms of accrued interest over the years. And Joseph Farrell has always said that the thing about the Bormann, which is basically, the ex-Nazi sort of thing, is that when they give you money to look after and you don't play right by it, they have the capability of hitting you, of coming after you. They are so entrenched. They're like the mafia of mafias. They make the Italian mafia. They make the organized crime in America look pretty small in comparison to what Joseph Farrell says Martin Bormann built. What Dave Emery talks about, the building of he always refers to it as the remarkable Bormann organization, and so on. And that Bormann organization has infiltrated back into European Union, into the banking establishments, through marriage and so on, into the Anglo-American banking elites and so on like that. And, so they have their role in all this. And I would not be in the slightest bit surprised if it's their system that Putin is attacking in Ukraine. And I think when the Chinese go into Taiwan, and I'll go as far as to say it's going to happen, and that it just has to happen. America's shown it cannot respond. All this talk about standing with Ukraine, why couldn't we stand with Yemen? Why couldn't we, stand, all this sort of stuff. Yemen's had far more carnage over the last few years, but nobody wants to stand. Nobody's sticking their little flags
How about
up.
we stay with Iraq? How about that?
Exactly. Yeah. But it really looks as if aside from the power of the media, whoever, what's his name, Joe Biden thinks he represents and so on like that, they don't have the power to militarily face down Putin, let alone China, and such. And, I think the best thing I've heard recently say is, Ukraine has won the Twitter war, but Russia has won the war in Ukraine. They've achieved their objectives. I think they still want to get Odessa, and I think they want to get, I forget the name of it. It's part of Moldova that wants to be, Moldavia that wants to be. Yeah, there's a part of it, Transnistria, something like that, and so on. So, I think Putin is going to turn Ukraine into a landlocked country, no access whatsoever to the Black Sea, and in the process shut down whatever it was in terms of biological, but in my opinion, actually more importantly, the financial laundering system. And that, because those billions going into Ukraine, I guarantee it's like all the billions that were sent to Africa and so on, right?
It goes into the pockets of the government.
It goes into the pockets of the government who pledged to then, so take Britain, okay? We've got vast parts of Africa that were under British Empire control during the 1800s and the early parts of the 20th century. So Britain has the inside track on doing deals, which whatever tin pot dictator has come to power in some of these countries that want to be able to take the money for themselves. Britain will facilitate that by going down and doing deals with them. And it's literally, so if you just take, here's $100 million, put 20 million into your own coffers and go and live the lifestyle that you want to have. But the other 20 million, that doesn't get spent on helping the local people get better hospital care, better food, better infrastructure. And that. We want you to spend that on British weapons. All right. And that money just, so all that money that we say, oh, it's our aid to Africa, and white nationalists here in this country will say, oh, why do we have to spend all this money on Africa and so on like that? The answer to that is we're not. We're giving it to African puppets who then send it straight back to our arms dealers, who then funnel the money back into the politicians who made the deal in the first place. Yeah. And this is the system that has been in line, and Ukraine is no different. The same thing is happening in Ukraine with American money, and it's going into bribing European officials for this and that policy or that sort of thing, or making sure that the right companies get the contracts with the deals and so on. And it's become so egregiously obvious that it appears to me they're in a panic. It's not being done the old easy way over time. It's get that money now. We've got to get it in there before Putin destroys everything and we can't get it around or whatever. So yeah, I see hope there for the destruction of what Farrell calls the international Nazi, and what Dave Emery calls the underground Reich.
Yeah. So when we, so you would say Taiwan is next, definitely.
I'm pretty convinced that the Chinese are taking a wait and see what happens in Russia and so on. I think the biological labs thing that came out of Ukraine is the reason why I think they'll go into Taiwan. And I would say that because, again, I recommend anybody to go and look at the Spitfire list of Dave Emery, to go and see the copious amount of work going all the way back to Japanese imperial fascism, Chiang Kai-shek and the establishment of Taiwan after the 1949 revolution in China that brought the communists to power. And you can see the control over drugs, the control over artifacts and looted treasure and so on like that. But most importantly, the people involved are all the usual suspects in the international fascist, milieu. Whether it's Chiang Kai-shek or Franco from Spain, or the remnants of Martin Bormann's organization, the Peronists of Argentina, and all right up to today. The biggest ones, the Anglo-American banking establishment have been in bed with these people and been facilitating them, for all this time. It seems that Ukraine became their go-to town because everything has its origins. I think that when they facilitated the establishment of Kosovo in the 1990s, all right, when they broke Kosovo away from Serbia, all right, Putin at the time said, you set a precedent for people just breaking away from countries to set up their own thing. Most of us in the conspiracy world knew that Kosovo was set up as a way of flying Afghan heroin into Europe, into a NATO base so it could be protected, and then distributed through the Kosovo mafia and so on, some of the flights going on into Brussels and such. That was the reason for Kosovo, other than the great big mineral deposits there and so on. It was a easy way to get the drugs from the Golden Crescent, that sort of Turkey through to Afghanistan type thing, into Europe, and facilitating it that way. But they set a precedent in what they did. And when Crimea broke away from Ukraine. That was what Putin said. He said, what's the difference between what Crimea is doing and what Kosovo did? The difference is they're doing it away from what you would call the Western, alliances. Kosovo became part of the Western alliance system. And so that was okay. But Crimea, that was a big problem, an insult to the democracy of Ukraine.
Yeah.
All this sort of stuff, all the usual hypocrisy. But it
As
goes
far as
back
I
into
remember,
that.
there was a referendum.
Yes, yeah, and supposedly there was a referendum in Kosovo. How many days did they bomb Belgrade? I think it was 97 days or something. It was over 90 days. That every day Belgrade was bombed by NATO forces. Sort of during that time. And yet everybody's got this, we stand by Ukraine now, when exactly the same scenario, but in reverse, is happening. But I think that the Kosovo situation was a prelude for what they turned Ukraine into. And when they had the Maidan revolution, color revolution, and so on, it was so obvious that the playbook was in play for Ukraine to become a captured state to this international system. That I would say, I call it Saturn Death Cult, but it's made up of components of what you would call the international Nazi and the Anglo-American banking sphere.
Yeah, it's always good to see that there are still countries who are not playing along to the prescribed script. Did you read it today that India's Supreme Court has banned today any restrictions against unvaccinated people? The court has ruled it is illegal to ban them from jobs, to refuse any entry, access to anything. Nobody is allowed to do that in India.
Yeah, they can't be treated differently.
Yeah, exactly. And then the Supreme Court said that, no human being should be forced, can be forced, should be forced. That is what the court said.
Well done, India. It's putting us in the West, and particularly in Western Europe, to shame. In terms of, who would have thought that India would be more of a beacon of freedom than Canada? But well done to India. I always found it fascinating at the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict when the American spokespeople would come on and say the whole world stands against Russia and so on. It's like, no, India has not condemned Russia. Pakistan has not condemned Russia. China's not condemned Russia.
Only 10% of the world population. We call West and the NATO axis, that is 10%. My goodness, what do they all think who and what they are? They are not representing the majority of the world's population.
It's funny, isn't it? They're the first to scream about democracy, but when you see a pure exercise in democracy, such as that sort of thing, they just will not recognize it, and they will. The great tragedy is that so many people who consider themselves left wing and so on, and anti-fascist, are supporting the very institutions and people who are backing what seems to be a highly entrenched fascist system in Ukraine itself. The fact that the Ukrainian military has almost self-autonomous parts of it that openly wear Nazi emblems, regalia of that kind. And that I'm talking about the Azovs and so on, like that Azov battalion and such. It's just incredible that we live in a world where even 5 years ago, some people were saying, you can't have, you've got to do something about the Nazis in Ukraine. But as soon as the war finishes, that's all forgotten. Putin has been very, very clear that denazification of Ukraine is one of his objectives.
Yeah.
I would say that there's a lot of truth in that, rather than people screaming, that the idea that he's mad. It's quite incredible. Everything that they threw at Trump, he was insane. He had cognitive problems. He had all these sorts of things. Now they're now doing
As
exactly the
opposed to
same thing.
Biden, yeah, who has all his
Yeah,
faculties together. Yeah.
yeah. But they're throwing it at this guy, this guy Putin, as if he's, he's only doing it all because, he's got some terminal disease and he wants to go out with a bang, or he's not functioning well and so on. And this is coming from mainstream media organizations. It's final proof that they're dead as a source of news.
I think of this as the second phase of the Great Reset.
Are you saying the reset as in what they planned, or the reset that they
can't
stop?
What started with the pandemic.
Yeah.
And now we are watching the second phase.
I think so. My optimism is that we're watching an attempt at the second phase, and it ain't going to plan. They're not getting the results.
I hope you are correct, but right now what I see is more and more supply lines breaking down, a looming food crisis. We will have big problems with electricity and so forth if they stay on that path. And so I don't see any player who's really doing something that would do the opposite.
Yeah, I would say, and I would be a liar to say that I've got inside intelligence that we could probably look at this and hope to this and so on. I have other thoughts that are more in the metaphysical side of things, where things are going and such. Anybody who reads my books knows that I use sort of Bible-derived nomenclature, terminology to describe the players at work.
I'm on board with you on that, because I firmly believe that at the end of the day, the light will win. Yeah. Yes, I'm totally on board.
Yeah.
But until that happens, there is a lot of ups and downs, and right now, I'm sorry to say this, but I see it more on the downward trend.
Right.
That it ultimately will fail. I'm convinced.
Yeah. But
the in between that we are facing right now, that's very important.
Yeah. Very, very difficult to tell. I think probably the only thing that we can really look at, with the resources that we have as individuals, is to educate ourselves in those things that immediately identify when someone is lying to you about something, or when somebody is pro something this way. Again, I wrote Saturn Death Cult to give people a tool to understand how Saturn worship in its distorted form has so influenced so many of our governmental institutions, our corporate institutions and so on, and in fact our whole culture in such a negative way. But as soon as we stop responding to the symbolism that triggers the archetypes within us, because we know that those archetypes simply refer to catastrophes, actual physical catastrophes from the past. They're not symbols of a power that can be harnessed in the supernatural to be brought against your enemies, attack magic and so on. In other words, a naturalistic understanding of what mythology is actually telling us once happened. When we have that naturalistic understanding, the power of those symbols, the way they, put their incantations and their little squiggles and that all over our money, all over our documents and things like that, to give a sense of authority to what they do, it becomes a joke. It becomes and it loses its power. We no longer look at people. Why are you in power? Well, I've got this thing that I call a dollar, and I had it printed up, and it's got these symbols on it, and so on like that. So you should accept my money as the only legal tender because I've got all of that symbolism. Worked in the past, but if more and more people find out that that this symbolism is really just triggering archetypes that you can control through knowledge, that you can overcome through knowledge and such, then it no longer has that power. And hopefully, you know, as a new generation in the metaphysical and spiritual world, we often talk about a great awakening, an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, things like that. Okay. And yes, some of us will look at it. Without that, it seems pretty fatal what's going on in the world to, as far as the human species being a free and autonomous, people to exist on the planet. These people look like they have all the control without that sort of idea. But I do honestly believe that a spiritual awakening is not necessarily somebody becoming ultra religious. A spiritual awakening is when your mind opens up. Hey, there are alternative explanations for history, for political ideologies, for the way we conduct our justice system. There are alternative ways that we can look at and explore that are different to what these people who have always been in control say is the only way.
Yeah.
And I think that's the awakening I'm hoping for.
Yeah. So that was a great first hour, Troy. We take a short break and then we come back and we see the patrons, because I desperately would like to try to figure out with you where it all went wrong in the past, in the ancient world. And I think that is a very interesting subject as well. So until next time, and we see the patrons on the other side. Bye-bye.